Okay, we'll move right now into our panel discussion. If we could have Dr. Bradshaw stay here, and Dr. Daniel C. Peterson, Dr. Jennifer Lane, Dr. Gary A. Rendsburg, and Dr. John W. Welch. Okay, so this is for all the panel. Stephen D. Ricks has pointed out that Hagar and Ishmael story shows us that there are no throwaway characters in the Abrahamic cycle. Would any of you like to comment on the importance of the other Abrahamic figures like Hagar, Ishmael, Lot and his family, Esau, and so forth?
Excellent question. And I'm going to again invoke one of the teachings of my teacher, Cyrus Gordon. So much of his work has informed my work. And Jack and I were talking yesterday, in fact, about the pathfinding work that Cyrus Gordon did on interconnections between the Greek world and the world of ancient Israel. One of the things he pointed out was, if you read the Iliad, there are no villains. Whether you're on the Achaean side or the Trojan side, and looking at the Trojans for the moment, Hector and Paris are as heroic as Menelaus, Agamemnon, and Odysseus. And he used that to compare the biblical characters. Her inclination might be just to favor Isaac over Ishmael and Jacob over Esau. After all, they're the bearers of the covenant. But that you're not supposed to, in any which way, turn Ishmael or Esau into a villain. They are equally as heroic, even if they're not the bearers of the covenant. So that's one point that I always like to make. Everybody has a heroic element to him or to her, which allows me to segue to Hagar. And I have published on this. This is one of my own insights, although I build on the work of other scholars on this one. Hagar is an overlooked character in the Bible. Hagar, however, represents, as do other low-ranking females in the Bible, Hagar represents Israel. And let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, the Bible always directs your attention to the lowly. I'm going to apologize to my fellow panelists here if it sounds like a second lecture I'm giving. The Bible always directs the reader's attention to the lowly, and that's because that was Israel's self-definition. Israel saw itself as the lowly. Israel knew that it was not the great power of the ancient world. It was not Egypt, it was not Assyria, it was not Babylonia, it wasn't even one of the major Canaanite city-states. And so this becomes Israel's self-definition. When Abraham and Sarah are on the stage, and to be honest, Abraham mistreats Sarah by trying to pass her off as his sister, your empathies should go to Sarah, certainly in chapter 12 and again in chapter 20. But when Hagar comes onto the stage, and Sarah mistreats Hagar at the beginning of chapter 16 so that Hagar flees the household, your empathies are now supposed to go to Hagar, who ranks even lower than Sarah. And to bear this out, God speaks to Sarah only once in the entire Abraham story, and somebody had that passage up on the screen today, and that's only to reprimand her for lying when she said, "I didn't laugh," and God says, "No, but you did laugh." That's the only time God speaks to Sarah. God speaks multiple times to Hagar, and in fact, lovingly, whether it's God or the angel of the Lord, as you have in Genesis 16, lovingly speaks to Hagar. And if you think of the Hagar story twice, both in chapter 16 and chapter 21, it is a woman alone in the first occasion, or with her son Ishmael on the second occasion, who are alone in the desert. And what does God do? God supplies water for Hagar, or Hagar and Ishmael, both times. We heard about Be'er Lachai Ro'i, and then also in Genesis 21. So who is Hagar? For whom does God supply water in the desert, right? Obviously, Hagar represents Israel. And when you begin to understand the layers of the biblical narrative, it is truly remarkable that these texts have such moral, human, theological, and every other which way messages to share with us, which hopefully still speak to us today. So I'll just end it right there, and maybe one of my fellow panelists would like to say something beyond my second mini lecture of the day.
Thank you for that. That really resonates with me, what you said, and that's why I love the story of Abraham, one of the many reasons. What I thought of when I read that question and thought of those characters was one, on the one hand, there's three things that made me think of. One was that the terms of the covenant of God with Abraham and for each of us are the same for all of us, but our mortal experience is different for each one. And that also correlates with another feeling I have about God's plan, if I can call it that, for each one of us. And that is that he's perfectly just, as we look at the characters, perfectly merciful, and that his plan is going to be extremely successful. If we look at the characters he's brought through thick and thin, some of which who were different and had failings and different things, and his plan was eminently successful in bringing many of them out to a much happier end than what they started with. And the third point is that the characteristics that make Abraham and his members of his family admirable are not supremely heroic things. Here I'd like to just read something, but more ordinary things. I'd like to read something from Hugh Nibley that I copied here. He said, "What office did Abraham hold? We know of none. What miracles did he perform? What dazzling appearances? He lived in the heroic age, a time of great migrations, of epic literature, but we read of no mighty combats, blow by blow, or challenges boasting heroic genealogy. His 10 trials were every man's trials. He was in trouble in business. The grass, water, and grazing rights on which he depended were often withheld from him. He never drove a hard bargain, not even with the king of Sodom or the generous Ephron the Hittite, who would have given in the burial cave for nothing, so he said. He yielded to Lot's greedy cattlemen and gracefully withdrew. His great zeal for the common good led him to plant trees and dig wells wherever his wanderings in the drought-ridden land led him, with no expectation of personal benefit for the enjoyment of those who would come after. At Hebron, he ran a school for outcasts, according to legend, where he received all comers. He always played fair. The saying is, charity was dead and Abraham revived it. It was a proverb. In the one obsession with crime and Western scenarios, the central theme is always the pleasure of revenge, watching the bad guys suffer, inflicting exquisite tortures, if possible, far surpassing those administered by the villains. Think of the Count of Monte Cristo. Such vengeance was not for Abraham. Josephus tells us that Abraham stubbornly pleaded with God to spare the wickedest people in the world because he felt sorry for them, because they were his friends and neighbors. That is almost inconceivable to us in our modern Sodom and Gomorrah. It is compassion and forgiveness alone that are the unfailing traits of the true descendants of Abraham. So he's a superman because he was an everyman, and he exemplified those simple virtues that each one of us is capable of.
Before we go to the next question, which I know is Matt's ready to give us, but just building on this idea of the everyman, I think if we take the question of the family and see it in a larger sense, that the member of the family of Abraham, because of covenant, is the Lord, and that it is because of the relationship with the Lord that each one of these characters have their power, and they become who they become, and they have the future that is almost indescribable, that each, the legacy of each of these, but it's because of the relationship with the Lord that makes them more than just an ordinary person, that allows them to take on that compassion, the mercy, the chesed that characterizes the Lord, that they start to, even their weakness, take on as well. And that's, I think, gives us all hope, being part of the Lord's family.
I'm not sure what the nature of the panel discussion is here, but it sounds like we each get a few moments to make some personal observations, if that's what you'd like.
Gary, so this is good.
We'll have other, he's got 3 or 4 questions.
More questions? Mm-hmm. Let's go to the more questions then. We can never have enough of those.
Okay, back to you.
All right, so the second question is for Dr. Rendsburg. As a Jewish scholar, you would likely agree that Abraham cannot be reduced to an academic question. He's the father of the nation, the first to be circumcised and given a promised land. So much of Judaism's liturgy and heritage is tied to him. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Excellent question, and of course, so true. The Bible is so large that we sometimes lose sight of the fact that the story, obviously prior to Abraham, there are 11 chapters, but that the story actually starts with Abraham. And when I say story, I really mean more than just the narrative, I mean the journey. And our focus, naturally, because he dominates 4 biblical books, goes to Moses, as I spoke about this morning, the greatness of David as the progenitor of the Messiah. So much of the Bible goes elsewhere, your mind goes elsewhere. But we have this amazing story where it actually commences with Abraham, and so we really need to think about that more often, and I think I'm guilty as charged as not doing enough of that. Except to say that in traditional Jewish liturgy, the key prayer known as the Amidah in Hebrew begins by blessing God, who is then defined as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So we are reminded on a daily basis of that teaching. I also do want to add that I belong to a more liberal branch of Judaism. Although it's called conservative Judaism, it's with a capital C. It attempts to combine the tradition, which we uphold, with some of our modern contemporary sensibilities, so that we actually now recite that prayer in an egalitarian way: the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Sarah, the God of Rachel, the God of Sarah, the God of Rebecca, the God of Rachel, the God of Leah. And that always reminds me, because this conference is Abraham and his family, that of course it's not Abraham alone, but obviously on the journey with him, Sarah, and as we talked about, the minor characters, if you will, Hagar, Ishmael, Lot, Eliezer, and so on. So this is something that we need to think about, and actually Jewish tradition reminds us to do it on a daily basis. When we recite the Amidah, it's actually recited twice daily, and or even 3 times, and 3 times or even 4 times on Sabbath and festivals. So it is built into the tradition, and I love the fact that we're being reminded of that through the daily prayers. But when we lose sight of that, it becomes a rote recitation that we then are brought back to it by this conference and the question that you've just asked, Matt.
Thank you. This is again to all of the panel. Which figures or aspects of the biblical and extra-biblical narratives about the family of Abraham are the most meaningful to you personally, and why?
No, I suppose for me it would change on any given day, any given time of the day. Today I was thinking about that passage where Abraham sees the stars and thinks, this is my God, and then the stars set, then the moon sets. I don't worship things that set, then the sun. And I just think that's a really interesting image for the idea that we often seek satisfaction in things that cannot by their nature give lasting satisfaction. Everything will set. you turn to things that look initially promising and they're not, they're inadequate. And I connect that in a very indirect way then with the line from Augustine's Confessions, our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. And I think that's a powerful lesson, and that little story illustrates that very well, I think. That there are things that are spectacular. The sun was worshipped in many cultures, but the sun itself, powerful though it is and life-sustaining though it is, isn't enough.
Come back to me. Yeah. Is that for me now? Yeah. And then it'll go back. We want to hear from everyone on. So of all the characters, I think for me, the character who is always behind the scenes here is Jehovah, is God, Abraham's God, all of their gods. They all worship this God. And I think for me, he is directing the traffic. He is rewarding their obedience. I think that this Son of God, this Jehovah, who will come to earth as Jesus Christ and will also make the kinds of sacrifices that Abraham did, and the patterns that are being set here are not accidental. I think that lots of this has been planned or taken advantage of. It wouldn't have happened without Abraham and all of the things that needed to happen. So all of the figures are important. And I think in the same way, all of us are necessary to the plan of God. We're all in this together, but mostly under his direction and with him. And for me, one thing we haven't said much about, of course, are blessings. And they bless God. They bless each other. The patriarchs finally get Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, blessing his 12 sons. We haven't talked about the testaments of the 12 patriarchs in this conference, but to Latter-day Saints and to Joseph Smith, the restoration of the office of patriarch, where we can all get patriarchal blessings, and some of us give those blessings. This is another way in which God's hand and love and mercy and guidance is a part of all of our lives. So above all, I think I see in this story the blessings of God, and how we are all blessed, and not alone, but together. And I like a lot what Gary said about covenant, land, a place, family. None of that can be had individually. It's all together. And the more together, the more righteous, the more better. The more better. More better we can be. I've been in Hawaii too long. But I just share that. That's my thoughts on what we've been doing in this conference, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Speaking on the question of what aspects, perhaps more than figures, but a theme of choosing to trust the promises. We have a new hymn that's recently been introduced to our growing hymnal of Standing on the Promises. And I think, looking particularly at Abraham and Sarah, they trusted what the Lord had promised. And I think of this passage in Hebrews 11, and of course there's a lot about Abraham there too, but this is about Sarah, and I think it points to when we realize our helplessness, we know that we have someone in whom we can trust because of the promises. So where it says Hebrews 11:11, through faith also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. And it's root understanding of salvation that Paul uses in Galatians and Romans. We're saved because we trust the one who has power to save us, because we are helpless to save ourselves. And that image of not being able to have children, I think, is an image of not being able to save ourselves. But there is one who has power, and if we trust him, then we know that it can happen. And they saw it happen, and we know that it can happen too.
Thanks. I'm going to be super personal here. This morning while I was driving down in the car with Samuel, my son, I was just reflecting on some things about my own life. Since the time I was very young, a young boy, I could say that I never really felt at home in this world. You know, I just felt like this was a passing place, and just never, wasn't, just not fitting in or whatever, but it was just a feeling of transitoriness that I felt even as a child. And I felt really connected to my ancestors. I had grandparents who were pioneers. They were that generation, and so I felt very connected to them. When I looked around me, I said, this is a whole different world than the one I related to. And then I discovered the scriptures very early in my life. And interestingly, I opened to Hebrews 11 again here, and I remember very clearly not only reading Genesis, which was my go-to place as a little boy, but also Hebrews 11. It says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in a land of promise, as in a strange country, etc., etc. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And then talks about Sarah, of course. And then it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. When I read that about strangers and pilgrims, I said, somebody knows exactly how I feel. I feel like I'm going somewhere, I'm not sure where. I'm not sure what the destination is, although I knew God was leading me, even as a young boy. And I know that there was somebody else who didn't really feel at home in this world, but was looking for that eternal city whose maker is God. And that's how I feel today. That's impacted me, and that's been a central part of my feeling about my life. I'm grateful for God for giving me that assurance through those promises.
I'm going to take you to Genesis chapter 37. I don't know who said the following. I wish I knew. Somebody, some teacher once asked, who's the most important person in the Bible? And, the students, the usual, Abraham, David, Moses. I'm out of order. Abraham, Moses, David, obviously in a Christian canon, Jesus, etc. And the teacher said no to all of those. The most important person in the Bible is the anonymous character in Genesis chapter 37, who has one line to speak. Let me set the stage for you. Jacob sends Joseph off to go check up on his brothers who are out shepherding. And when he gets to Shechem, Joseph can't find his brothers. And an unnamed character, man, sees Joseph wandering around, and he says, what are you seeking? Ma tivakesh, what are you seeking? And Joseph says, Et achayani mivakesh, I'm seeking my brothers. And he said, I overheard them. They said they were going off to Dotan, which is further north. And Joseph continues on to Dotan. And you know what happens, right? If the brothers see him coming, they throw him into a well, they strip him of his coat, they dip it in the blood, and they sell him as a slave, and so on and so forth. Okay. If that man isn't there, what happens? Joseph returns home to Jacob, and he says, Daddy, I couldn't find them. End of story. But instead, Joseph is now in Egypt because of that man. And this is, and if Joseph's not in Egypt, the whole biblical story doesn't occur, right? Jacob's sons go down to Egypt looking for grain. They don't get invited to stay in Egypt. They don't, what happens? Some other person would have been in the position of viceroy to the Pharaoh. And then there's no Exodus. And if there's no Exodus, there's no Mount Sinai event. And if there's no Mount Sinai event, there's no tabernacle. Everybody understand what I'm saying here, right? So, Jack, when you talk about how every single human is part of this journey, This is an anonymous character, and the teaching there is that this nameless, faceless person in Genesis 37, if you want to extrapolate, is the most important person in the entire Bible. The biblical narrative doesn't occur, and this person is so important that the medieval commentator Rashi says that this person was an angel, malach. The other medieval Jewish commentator, Abraham ibn Ezra, says, no, it was a man. And I side with Ibn Ezra on this one because I always want to stress the human. And that is what is so remarkable about the Bible. Jack was alluding to that, or stating it more than with allusion explicitly. Every single human has a role to play on this planet. And we may not know it when it's happening. We may not know it until years later. And there you have it. We don't know about this anonymous, faceless, nameless person in middle of nowhere outside of Shechem who encounters Joseph looking for his brothers. But because of that individual, the rest of the story unfolds.
Thank you. Beautifully said, all of you. This last question is for the whole panel, but I want to direct it first to Dr. Peterson. In full interest of full disclosure, this speaks to the institutional mission of BYU Hawaii, where I teach. How can a better mutual understanding of the Abrahamic traditions in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity among the adherents of those faiths lay a foundation for a more effective dialogue and peace and conflict resolution going forward?
One of the reasons I've been having a hard time today is I'm jet lagged. I just got back not too long ago from Uzbekistan. I was up for, I calculated 54 straight hours, and anyway, it's the gift that goes on giving. But we were over there having a Christian-Muslim dialogue. Turned out to be, since it was organized to a certain extent by people from Utah, it was largely a Latter-day Saint Muslim dialogue. And the most interesting part of it to me was a 6-hour session that 8 of us had the first day, actually before the formal conference began. It was 4 of us from Utah and 4 Iranian Shiite professors from Tehran and from Qom, the holy city there, the Shiite holy city. And it was behind closed doors. It was not for the public. It was, we didn't even take photographs. We didn't want it to necessarily get them in trouble. It was amazingly frank. They were amazingly candid about their attitudes toward the regime and what it was doing, corrupting Islam in their view, and driving young people away from belief from having faith. 2 of them were imams, actually. I mean, they were all very devout. We had to take a couple of breaks for prayer and so on. But what struck me was the great common ground that we had. And so I had not met any of them before. A couple of the others had, but we spent the next several days going around to sites in Samarkand and Bukhara and so on, and friendly, but making comments from shared moral and theological territory about the things we were seeing. We were in the tomb of Tamerlane, spectacular building. But the local guide was going on and on about Timur the Great, and I was thinking, I think actually he was a sociopath. He was a monster of cruelty and so on. One of the Shiites leaned over to me. He says, "Do you know anything about Tamerlane?" I said, "Yes." He was a monster. He was a horrible, evil man. And I thought, we're fairly close together. Now, I could have had the same experience, I suppose, with Buddhists who are not Abrahamic in their religiosity, but it has sometimes struck me that you have to share territory, you have to share a border, you have to be contiguous to one another to have strife. I mean, countries that are next to one another, it's easier now with missiles, but it used to be you had to share a border or something to have a fight. And it's precisely the shared quality of our background that makes possible dialogue and conflict, because we're in conflict over what our shared territory means. But I just found this really rather a moving experience. I've been to Iran once. I've been invited now to go back in October. I don't know if I'll be able to swing that, but really we formed close relationships in just the matter of a few days. And it was partly because of, I think, the Abrahamic nature of the faith that we share, the common moral language that we speak, despite the differences.
Somewhat in line with Dan's comment, to my mind, I'm not a specialist on the modern Middle East at all, but so many of the countries have poor leadership. And poor doesn't even begin to describe the leadership of so many of the countries. And to me, the only hope, I shouldn't say the only hope, I'd rather be a little more optimistic, but the great hope is what you just have described, where just a group of people get together without any public display or governmental sponsorship. And this is where this is the future of the dialogue and the trialogue, is to ensure that people come together with shared common interests. I will give you just one example of a group that I know well, because I have worked on behalf of the group and raised funds, either my own personal funds, which is not as much as I would like to be able to donate, but have raised from others. There's a place in the south of Israel called the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. I myself am, and my entire family lives for the environment, everything from composting to recycling and everything else that we do in our home. And the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies brings together Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The director of the institute, he's not the founding director retired. The current director is a Jerusalem Arab Muslim. And it is just remarkable to see what these young people can do when they don't talk about the world around them. Their motto is, one land, one air, one water, right? All we have is the same land, the same environment, the same crops, the same soil, the same water resources, and they are doing God's work on the earth right now as we speak. That's where the future lies. That's my hope and my vision for the better world.
Thank you. I guess not surprisingly, we find ourselves in very great agreement, I'm sure, across the whole panel. I just felt to share a very eloquent statement that's quoted by Yehetzkel Landau, and he's quoting Rabbi Abraham Isaac Koch, who said this: "The brotherly love of Esau and Jacob, of Isaac and Ishmael, will assert itself above all the confusion that the evil brought on by our bodily nature has engendered. It will overcome them and transform them to eternal light and compassion." And then Landau goes on to say, "Given the ongoing bitter and bloody conflict between Israelis and Palestinians over their common homeland, such messianic visions seem absurd to most people, wishful thinking at best. But the future depends on us, on what we do, on how we understand what is truly holy based on our respective faith traditions. Jews, Muslims, and Christians all need to broaden their sense of the sacred, to affirm that life is holier than land, that God's love and blessing are bestowed upon all equally without hierarchical favoritism, and that inclusive justice and compassion sorry, it's just the dry air, I think, are both the essential attributes of the divine and the central imperatives to guide our behavior. Once we do this, we will have the capacity to change our current scripts." And then he closes by saying, "If we choose this path of devotion, ready to sacrifice land rather than human lives, then the reconciliation which Ishmael and Isaac experienced in their lifetime can serve as an example for us, their faithful descendants, inshallah, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, if God wills it, and we do too.
The question of the anonymous individual in Genesis who asked Joseph, what are you looking for? Who are you seeking? And this Joseph's answer keeps coming back to me as we think about this question where he says, I'm looking for my brothers. And I think in each of these traditions, the sense of love for God and love for neighbor is so deep. And that, again, this what holiness looks like in each tradition as we all live it out more fully is going to be looking for our brothers and sisters and treating them with love and compassion. And that's the best way to be the heirs of Abraham and Sarah and to be who we need to be, all of us. And I think that question is, and the answer, it has to be our answer, that we are looking for our brothers and sisters.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. If I started this the last time going that way, and it's now come back to me, is this chiastic, or are we?
It's the only way the world operates.
Maybe, who knows? But if this will be my last comment, I think. Is that right?
You know, it wouldn't have structured itself that way if you weren't on the panel.
Oh, okay.
Because you're on the panel.
Well, there's so many virtues here in this Abrahamic saga. And it's there at the beginning of the Bible and the beginning of the scriptures for a lot of reasons. And so I think all of what we've been saying, good advice to everyone listening and to ourselves. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned that I'd like to, that it just struck me though, is that what we all need is a little more patience. Patience. What is patience? You look at the root of that, it's the same root as suffering. And Abraham suffered. They couldn't see a way in which anything could possibly come. How could this all happen? But they had patience, and somehow, beyond anybody's wildest expectations, things came together, things worked. And I think as the ancient Israelites look back on this heritage that had been given to them, they also could be patient and be patient with the Lord and suffer those things that needed to be given. In addition to patience, I think it takes an effort to understand and to be concerned and do what we can, and try not to make matters worse, and to see above all that there is a plan, that there is an order. Abraham the astronomer looked up and saw the order of the sky, the order of the universe, the order of the day and the night and the world around us. There's so much order. And I think that the word cosmos, in Greek, of course, that means the world, but cosmos, cosmetic, it also means beauty. And things are, when they're ordered, there is a beauty to it. And as we stand back and look at the bigger picture and understand all of the factors and the goals and things that are on the horizon yet to come, I think that gives us faith and faithfulness and patience and cooperation and working with challenges. I think that's what the world could use a little more of. I know I can too. But I thank Abraham for that wonderful model.
Matt, you haven't said anything.
I'm not sure that I could add anything after everything that's been said. And I just want to thank all of you for what you have said. I am really grateful that I've been sitting on this stage tonight with all of you. Grateful for everything that you've shared. Just on the subject of Abraham, I'll just maybe wrap it up with this question and kind of what we've been talking about with this. Yeah, you're familiar with Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11, where the prophet foretells that the Lord would set his hand again the second time to gather his people. And then there's a list of 7 nations, and then an 8th element. And when I go through this passage with my students, they'll recognize Egypt. Everybody does. They recognize Assyria, especially after the lesson, talking about the Syro-Ephraimite crisis in the previous chapters. A few will recognize Cush, but no one recognizes the other nations. But then I point out to them that that's not the point. It's the 7 is the point, the number of completion, of wholeness, the idea that this future gathering of the Lord's people would be a perfect, whole, and complete gathering. And then, since these are classes at BYU Hawaii, I ask everybody to identify which nations they come from. And in almost every instance, we match the number 7 in Isaiah in terms of the nations, because the student body come from, not just the Pacific and the Asian Rim, but the whole world. And so then they see that, they start to envision how they might fit into this kind of a prophecy, how they might see themselves in its fulfillment. But then we add the 8th element, which is appropriate at BYU Hawaii on the North Shore, and from the Isles of the Sea, and then it hits them. I feel very blessed in my associations with all of you. I know Dr. Rendsburg I've met for the first time today, but I've been reading his work for a long time, and I do know that all of us have what we do in life isn't insignificant. That what we do matters. That we matter, and that to a God that can promise posterity to a barren couple as numerous as the sands of the sea or the stars of heaven, and and count the numbers of hairs on the head. Some of us that's easy, others not as easy, but we matter, and we matter to him. And once that truth sinks deep into our souls, that truth's life-changing, and it has a claim thereafter on how we treat each other, and I'm grateful that Abraham and Sarah and their family in so many ways. I mean, the story models, yes, in ways, the dysfunctions of human existence, but Abraham is a model of chesed that we can follow. Rebecca is a model of chesed, and we could cite other instances. So I'm just thankful to be here and to have been a part of this. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone who's presented.
Thank you.